actually my question, because you talked about the disconnect between governance and ordinary people. And this has their level of human insecurity, in fact, made them vulnerable to armed groups. Isn't that sort of like a vicious cycle wherein, due to the disconnect, you have people being enticed to join or having the motivation to join armed resistance, which later on would justify the continued existence and implementation of martial law in various areas of Mindanao.
That's the dilemma of the state LEU kasi the government acts very slow and the armed groups, they act very fast. So by the time you find a solution to the government finds a solution to a certain problem, the nature of threat has already evolved because they act twice as fast than the government. Like for example, you want to rebuild Malawi. The government is slow by nature of the bureaucracy and the political process and all the technicalities. But at the same time, armed groups, they recruit very fast. And now, 2 years have passed. And within that 2 years, well, the most affected area is still there. No upward and no vertical and horizontal infrastructures. But in 2 years, we already have, cadre of another local fighters that the government needs to face.
Thank you, Rommel. So I'd like to lead to that next discussion, because martial law when President Duterte attempted or pushed forward the idea of martial law for not just for Marawi, but I think for most areas of Mindanao, it was met with resistance, from various sectors, various groups, but eventually it was passed by Congress. It was approved by Congress with an overwhelming majority from both the House and the Senate. And then it's also virtually unheard of for martial law in our history, with the exception of the time of President, for martial law to be extended again with an overwhelming majority from both houses of Congress. I would just like to get your ideas about this, Herman, because it seems, if we can use Marawi as a microcosm, the disconnect between government and people, it seems to be not just on a local level like Marawi or an island level like Mindanao, but even from a national level, where you have on one hand people's aspirations and then democratic institutions doing something else or implementing projects or policies of a different direction.
This is where the question of institutionalized governance actually comes in, right? The assumption is that it doesn't matter which party is in power. Not that there are really political parties here, but it doesn't matter which party is in power, who is the president, and which administration is actually in control of government. That there's still a continuity as far as policies are actually concerned, right? There are a number of issues here. Number one is that, and this is connected to the idea of martial law. Why are we turning to martial law, for instance? Why is it something that the Duterte administration sees as the way out of the kind of problems that we actually have now? It's a shortcut, right? It's somehow a recognition, or at least a sense on the part of the administration that going with normal politics is not going to actually address the kinds of issues that we actually have, right? Especially if you're talking about time-bound or time urgent kinds of issues. If we talk about the Marawi rehab, for instance, as people continue to be prevented from continuing with their normal lives, then the level of frustration and the expectations that they actually have keep on growing up. So the question there is, can normal politics deliver on this, right? And I think the sense of the administration is that no, right? And we can see this in terms of other issues, right? When we talk about the idea of traffic in Metro Manila, for instance, right? It's a big issue. Why? Because some estimates made by the Asian Development Bank several years back, I've actually said that our economic losses because of everyday traffic are enormous, for instance, right? And what is it that President Duterte is actually saying? That you have to give me emergency powers in order for me to be able to deal with the issue of, if you don't give me emergency powers, then I'm sorry, then that's not something that we can actually deal with. So in other words, the sense is a diminution, if you will, of trust in local political processes, right? The sense is that we have to actually do shortcuts. We have to do emergency or to institute emergency mechanisms in order to be able to address all of these issues. Now, we can't operate that way, right? In other words, this is where the issue of government capacity, of state capacity actually comes in. We can't keep on saying that, well, in order to address, in other words, we can't keep on dealing with everyday everyday problems, no, as crisis, right? In other shortcuts, di ba? That's basically what's going on right now. That we're treating what ought to be normal political processes or normal political issues, no, as crisis situations, which require no urgent certain urgency, no, and therefore a demand on our part to actually move from normal politics to something else. And I think we have to get out of that mindset, right? Although admittedly, we've dug the hole, you know, over all of these decades of. I won't say that. I won't say that it's been misgovernance, if you will, right? But it's just that so many things that are really basic, no, and that has to do with government capacities to do, you know, agencies being able to do what they're supposed to do, right? Have been set aside, no, and the tendency is to actually act on these things, no, in terms of emergency conditions, not treating them as crisis, for instance, no, and trying to the idea of the increase in our inflation rate, for instance, no, just towards the end of 2018, for instance, the question there is what needs to be done, and of course there were a lot of issues that were actually being brought in, but it's not normal politics that was actually being advanced there, right? We need to actually bring in things like tarification, like, you know, and this has to be urgently addressed, right? Which raises questions of why is it that every time we deal with these kinds of problems, it's always a crisis, right?
Which requires centralization of power.
Exactly, right? So we, to a large extent, this is something that we need to actually address to a large extent, right? The over reliance on governments, more particularly the over reliance in areas where you have crisis conditions like Mindanao, for instance, the over reliance on the military being able to being at the forefront of what is essentially governance, right? So, in other words, what we need to do is strengthen government capacities to do normal government activities, no, and address normal and to undertake those activities in order to address normal issues, no, so that we don't get to a point where it's always going to be a crisis that we need to actually address.
That's an interesting point, Herman, because I was thinking you mentioned something about crisis, urgency, and yet not every issue is a crisis, no? It requires, rather than an immediate action, it requires government to work or function properly. But what I was thinking was, for people of a certain position or certain privileges, they can wait, no? But I was thinking, because that might be the root, no, of the popularity, no, because even with all these issues, no, the popularity rate of the government in particular, no, seems to be still very high. But what I was thinking was, most people, especially those in impoverished areas or those who are not in privileged positions, they're in the hole that you were mentioning. They're at the bottom of the hole, and they feel that government and actual proper government function will not lead to immediate relief. So that's why they feel President Duterte, or there is a need for authoritarian rule, centralization of power. No? For them, what do you think would be the trade-offs for such a scenario wherein, for example, Marawi, due to the influence on Congress, he can and now especially in the recent elections, no, where now a supermajority is is in the supermajority in the legislative is actually now connected to or engaging. There's a very close connection between the administration, and then you have the judiciary now being, I think, how many appointees I think does the President Duterte have for this particular batch of justices? But I think it will comprise a significant majority, no? And then of course you have issues or allegations, no, that the executive is interfering, no, with the judiciary because they feel the judiciary is a barrier to necessary emergency actions. What would be the trade-off in the event that centralization of power or authoritarian rule does happen? Siguro, let's start with you, Rommel.
Well, what we have right now is a populist government with a very limited time to deliver his campaign promises. So the government now resorts to a lot of shortcuts in order to continue the popularity. So that's now the situation that we have. So my sense is that this government is more interested on short-term gain without looking into the long-term consequences. Anyway, he will only stay until 2022. So that's
assuming
why,
he stays until 2022.
Yeah. So that's his mind frame to remain popular and use this popularity to justify what he's currently doing. So that's now the style of the government right now. And if you will look at his tendency is really very illiberal, not the illiberal meaning using the trappings
That's
of
a very
democracy.
interesting term. Not non-liberal, but illiberal.
Illiberal, yeah. He's an illiberal leader using the trappings of democracy to justify his leadership, but at the same time undermining the same democracy through his authoritarian approach. Anyway, this is the style of the Duterte government. But the good thing, we still have the democratic institutions, and we can still use these democratic institutions to check the current government and account for the abuse in power. But at the same time, Duterte is taking advantage of this popularity to lure other government officials to rally behind him. So now he has the support of the judiciary, the Congress, the local governments. Now, that encourages him more to do a lot of extrajudicial measures to address many problems that we face as a nation. That's why he always makes as an issue a crisis in order to justify his action. So, in fact, my term for that is that he wants to securitize everything to justify security measure. He's securitizing everything. Even the problem of traffic is securitized. So in traffic of MMDA, a former military, the LG, now there is a pending bill in Congress about law for homeland security in order to empower the local government on security matters. Then we now have the amendment of the Human Security Act of 2007, which will become the new anti-terrorism law by this year. Now we have the ROTC bill.
Mandatory ROTC.
Now there's now a bill in Congress on the National Defense Act, a new National Defense Act. So a lot of measures that this government wants to have in order to justify more power of the state. More power of the state. So that's now the situation. And the police is happy. The military is happy because it's empowering them. But the good thing is that we still have the 1987 Constitution. Now, they want to change the 1987 Constitution in order to adopt a new political system that will be federal in form. But I don't think that will prosper by 2022. But what the Philippine government is doing now is, by these issues, now Duterte now have enough room for political maneuver with all these people behind him. And the result of the election this year is like a zeal of approval of what it's doing. So, and now the people seems to like it. The popularity is still high, but the middle class like us, the intellectual like us, find it very problematic.
Thank you. Anything to add, Herman?
Yes, I agree with what Rommel is actually saying, and to a large extent, one of the things that needs to be taken into consideration here is that balance between short-term problem solving and the long-term consequences that this might have, for things like institutions, for instance, right? And I think this is part of the shall we say, the attempts on our part to really reflect on, what is it that we're actually facing right now, because the question here is, are we in agreement with the idea that a president with authoritarian tendencies is actually what we need, right? And I think many of the surveys that actually show that he's popular, actually might not agree with that particular point, but they like what President Duterte, or at least the kind of projection that President Duterte is actually making. And in this case, it's really a question of, well, what exactly is it that he has actually been able to achieve? People see that there are achievements, that there are that the administration is doing something, right? That might be debatable, but at least as far as the large majority that the surveys actually show of approval for what he is actually doing, seems to indicate that that people seem to actually believe in his leadership. And I think the problem there, of course, is that, we're looking at the short-term consequences, right? He has done a number of things that we actually that people actually like, for instance. But the question there, of course, is, well, over the long term, if it's no longer a Duterte who's actually sitting as president, what are the consequences then, right? Because that means that we must constantly have somebody with that kind of authoritarian tendency to make things actually work. If we're going to ignore the consequences as far as the strengthening of institutions, that kind of leadership is actually going to lead to.
Definitely. Because I was thinking as well, because the centralization of power, the concentration of power on the executive, specifically the president, it has local ramifications, definitely. But what about international relations? Because I remember, I think it was under the Duterte term when we arbitrarily pulled out from the International Criminal Court, which is an international agreement, but all of a sudden, that since the executive said we do not want this, they were able to pull it out. So the institutions were actually supposed to be in place for that issue. It doesn't mean that it was a correct or incorrect action, but rather there were institutions that should have, at the very least, engaged that discussion. So given the supermajority, the concentration of power, on the executive, how does that impact foreign relations, especially since there is an issue with China and national sovereignty? Just recently, I think it was June 9, right, when a Filipino fishing vessel was sunk and then abandoned by the What do you think about this notion of concentration of power and then international relations with China? Let's start with you.
Well, democratic states, particularly from Northern America and Western Europe, they have a problem with Duterte. But the rest of the world, they don't have any problem, like Russia does not have any problem. China does not have any problem. Turkey does not have any problem. The Arab world, they don't have any problem.
But what seems to be the common denominator with the states?
Well, that's the common denominator is that Duterte knows that it's dealing with other states with similar characteristics. That these are strong men, they find democracy too limiting for governance. So that's why in the academy now we are now debating on democracy. What from the third wave of democracy after the end of the Cold War, now we have a regression, democratic regression. So that's the kind of context where you can see Duterte's leadership now. So Duterte is very popular in selected countries in Southeast Asia, very popular in Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, even in Singapore, in Malaysia, and even Indonesia, popular. And what are these states? And if you will also see, we are so close with North Korea. We're so close with North Korea. Okay, but at the same time, the Philippines is also very close with Japan, and the Philippines continues to be an ally of the United States. We continue to have very good relationship with Australia, although they have problems on the way Duterte is doing on the area of democracy and human rights, but they still have very good relationship with Duterte. And what Duterte is doing now is, I think, it's a clever diplomacy of dealing with the major powers and dealing with the smaller states. This government knows how to deal with the needs of all these foreign countries. Like, for example, we continue to have very strong relationship with the United States despite our so-called paradigm shift to China. In fact, in my conversation with American and Chinese experts, there is now an issue. If you go to China, China is happy about friendly gesture of Duterte, but at the same time, China is questioning the sincerity of Duterte, because Duterte is still having this good relationship with the United States. But if you talk to the United States experts, they're questioning the loyalty of Philippine government to the alliance system. But now, Duterte is so pragmatic to really play the major power game, and at the same time play with the smaller states in ASEAN. He knows how to deal with ASEAN. But what's the outcome of all these things? What the outcome of all these things? I think we're getting things from US because of that. We continue to receive foreign military assistance from the United States. This year alone, we're having a lot, like more than 200 different joint military exercises with our American counterparts, with the participation of other states like Japan and Australia. Now we are receiving a lot of deals with China, although big ticket deals are still not being delivered, but still we're getting. And we're getting a lot more from Japan. In fact, among all the major powers, we're getting concrete things from Japan. So if you will notice now from the recent statements of President Duterte, I think Prime Minister Abe has influenced the thinking, the current thinking now of Duterte when it comes to the issue of the South China Sea and when it comes to our relationship with China. I think his visit to Japan really created very big impact on the current thinking now of Duterte. And now we just finished the still ongoing meeting in Honolulu, Hawaii on the Mutual Defense Board, and that is influencing the meeting. And now President Duterte and President Xi Jinping met in Beijing last April during the second BRI forum meeting, the Belt and Road Initiative meeting. So all these things are now making many states being puzzled. So what's your end game? What's your bottom line? And I think the bottom line is of the Duterte, I want to get the best of all these worlds. Okay. And I think that's making the Duterte government very resilient in the area of foreign policy, in the area of international diplomacy.